With me, as always, is Shawn Siegele. You can find all of his great work over at RotoViz. We are recording, coming to you live on Black Monday, as it's known around the league, the Monday after the Week 18 Sunday, where a lot of coaches are fired. And it's possible that more information will come out after we have even had this conversation. But there have been some interesting decisions already around the league. Just today, this morning, I believe, we found out that Lou Anarumo has been let go from the Bengals. Their defensive coordinator, Ryan Grubb, was let go from the Seahawks after 1 year as their offensive coordinator. Found out on Sunday that Gerard Mayo was let go. The Jaguars fired Doug Peterson, but decided to retain Trent Baalke as their GM, which is really questionable because he's had some. I mean, the whole season between Peterson and Baalke seemed to be Peterson kind of commenting that Baalke hadn't got him good players, which has been sort of the issue with Baalke for a long time. It's interesting that Baalke's retained there. Mike McDaniel, Brian Dable, their owners released statements saying that they would retain those guys in Miami and for the Giants. Ken Dorsey got fired from the Browns as an offensive coordinator. I mean, those were all just some of the notes that we saw this morning, some of the things we may talk about. We also had a full Week 18 slate, a lot of things going on, a lot of people that may be still listening to our pod, but maybe weren't paying heavy attention to Week 18. And you do kind of want to know some of the things that happened that influence some of the sort of full season stats and some of that stuff. It's not you hear a lot that because Week 18 is just Week 18 that we should throw out these stats and we shouldn't consider them when we talk about the players and this, that, and the other thing. But the stats were still compiled. I mean, these players still went out there and made plays and scored touchdowns and put up numbers. In some cases, it is against weaker defenses. In some cases, there are some things that are happening that make the situations maybe slightly less competitive, but I still think it's a note, right? in a certain direction for the player that they're able to actually succeed on an NFL field and do things, regardless of whether it's Week 18 or not. So anyway, there's a lot of fascinating stuff. Tyreek Hill seemed to demand a trade. That came up in his post-game conference on Sunday. But yeah, we're going to talk through some of this Week 18 stuff, some of the end of regular season stuff, some of the coaching changes stuff, because that has impact on fantasy and it's just interesting. But yeah, how you doing, Shawn?
Good. We got another touchdown for Trey McBride. He doesn't finish the season with just the one.
All he does is catch touchdowns now.
All he does. You did get the impression that the Kansas City Chiefs not only were playing bad players, but they actively wanted them to also play poorly, which is the same thing you've gotten from the 49ers defense the last couple of weeks. We've watched enough Kyler Murray to know that this game here, where he throws for 4 touchdowns. Now, again, he still somehow averages less than 7 yards per attempt. But the Arizona Cardinals putting up 47 points, that is not a real score. But there were lots of interesting things that happened when I worked through this week a lot different than the normal weeks. I mostly chimed into or dived into the viewing to watch the Broncos do what they did. It was weird because as a Chiefs fan, you were rooting for them to lose. You didn't want the Cincinnati Bengals to end up in the playoffs and add a second, or in this case, I guess, a fourth potentially really good team. There is the question of whether the Broncos really are much, if any, worse than the Bengals. Obviously, they went to overtime with them the previous week. I'm sure that in the aftermath, Andy Reid was not happy about being beaten quite that soundly. It does change a little bit of look of your overall numbers for the season. One of the things that I was only really realizing as we got into this game a little bit, and the Chiefs, weren't playing their guys, you think about the situation with Saquon Barkley, where he's not playing, even though he has a chance at a record the team is trying to set themselves up to be the best version of themselves in the playoffs. But Ben, if the Chiefs had come through in that game against the Bills, they would have had to have been playing all out against this Broncos team in week 18 to go undefeated, right?
To go 17-0. Yeah, I think. Well, I mean, it's hard. It's hard to say, right? I mean, I would have thought that the Eagles would have gave Saquon Barkley the opportunity at history, but they didn't, and I don't think that's wrong either because they have bigger goals and all those things. I would have thought. I mean, I guess the other interrelated thing was the Bucks were trying to get the ball to Mike Evans quite a bit in this game. I wouldn't say it was like why they were struggling necessarily, but they were struggling against the Saints and they had to win that game. Falcons game was going on at the same time, wound up going to OT. For all they knew, the Falcons were going to win against the Panthers, which that was maybe the game of the day on Sunday. You had Michael Penix and Bryce Young playing really good football, and it was really fun to see in terms of what that might mean for the NFC South in the future. That division needs, some good quarterback play for sure. But the Bucks were sort of struggling. They finally, put the Saints away. They score a touchdown. They get the ball back. They're winning by 8. They can kneel it out. But all Mike Evans needs is 5 more yards to get his 1,000 yards. So they throw the ball to Mike Evans on a play where the Saints more or less just let him get his record, but could have, where the ball's going. I mean, I'm kind of surprised they didn't like double cover him because you could potentially intercept that pass, potentially run it back for a touchdown if you're like, I'm jumping this route no matter what, wherever Mike Evans is. And then, again, it's an 8-point game. You could potentially be forcing OT. The Bucks took a little bit of a risk there. It wasn't like they had a smart play call. Liam Cohen's a good offensive coordinator. In terms of like, if you're going to take a little bit of a risk, they went trips to the left. They had Evans as the farthest inside receiver. Both the outside receivers run a quick vertical route, and Evans runs a quick out pattern underneath that. So in terms of a defender coming to jump the Evans route, they had 2 other routes running right at them, which is, totally designed to give Evans the opportunity to catch this pass unabated underneath, and then turn it upfield, get his 5 yards, right? And it was a really good play call for like a safe pass. But even that, like, Baker's known for getting passes deflected at the line of scrimmage. Even that could have been the risk, right? It could have got tipped up in the air or something. They're probably going to do a quick pass. At any rate, Evans gets his record. That's an example of a team. And I loved it. I'm so glad they went and did that. We always talk about this stuff was, first of all, the stuff matters. You could see the Bucks seemed more excited about Evans getting his record than the fact that they just made the postseason. They didn't really seem to care that much about winning the game until the point that Evans got his record. And then the whole team mobbed him on the field. They went absolutely nuts. It matters to the players. It matters to these guys who worked their butt off. This is a career achievement thing for Mike Evans. It's really, really cool that their coaching staff wasn't like, there's nothing we could do. We had already won the game. We needed to just kneel this out. It's the way it had to be. So yeah, pretty exciting stuff to see Evans get that, to see the Bucks approach it that way. Yeah,
in the
Super
Chiefs
Bowls
Broncos game, you have a situation there where it was this combination of a lack of respect for the Chiefs backups and also a tiny bit of a weird dynamic where the Broncos have to win, but there was a lot of coverage from the broadcast team of them trying to get Cortland Sutton to his incentives, which, there were some guys with huge incentives out there. One of the main threads in the Seahawks Rams game was that Geno had, $6 million worth of total incentives. Cortland Sutton wasn't in that range, but they were definitely trying to get him to his, including throwing a deep pass to him early. The Broncos were trying to blow the Chiefs out and get their guys the incentives early enough that they could, rest their guys by midway through the third quarter. That's how uncompetitive that game was. But there were situations where teams are resting players like Seahawks Rams that we talked about, where the Seahawks barely came through. There were situations, that was a weird game too, because the Rams actually did have a little bit to play for, depending on who you think they actually would like to play in the playoffs. The Commanders benched Jaden Daniels again in a situation where, like, it's actually arguably a pretty big deal who you play. And so the fact that the Commanders do come through, the Rams don't, but get very close. against the Seahawks team that's playing all out to try and go into the break on a high note, in addition to, again, those incentives. A lot of weird dynamics, which, again, I think that the version of the Chiefs that was out there was very poor, and yet the version of the Saints, just with their guys who are still healthy, very, very poor. So there's no guarantee that you're going to blow a team out just because they're playing their backups.
Yeah, it was I mean, it was a fascinating week for all of that. To that extent, I mean, I sent some tweets about this, Sean, and got some response. So I kind of want to get your notes on it, but I want to jump over to the Patriots, where they beat the Bills backups. And as a result, they fall from first to fourth in the draft order, which is massive. Yeah, they don't need a quarterback, and that's what people are talking about. But a lot of the Patriot fans were like, we're hoping that we can get one of those Godfather offers, even though it isn't necessarily considered a great 2025 class. But you can trade back to fourth, or maybe a little bit further, but you can, for that trade back, get next year's first and an additional maybe like second this year or third, like a day 2 pick, and possibly more. Some of the packages are meaningfully more than that, but those are probably in years where the quarterbacks are a little bit more desirable. But that's, I think, what Patriots fans wanted, was if you're going to go from first to fourth, you're not doing it because you want a meaningless game. You're doing it because you're getting an additional day 2 pick and maybe a future first as well. And you're getting all this extra trade compensation that helps you address multiple needs, which is what all teams that are rebuilding should want, frankly, is more picks, more valuable picks. They go out and they win this game. I tweeted out that if they were going to fire Gerard Mayo anyway, because what really seems to be coming together is they were going to fire Gerard Mayo anyway. They fired him basically right after the game, and almost immediately there was reports that Mike Vrabel is very interested, that he only interviewed with the Jets, the hated rival Jets, to put pressure on the Patriots, that he has a coaching staff in place. Like the reports had details like that, the Jets interview element, the coaching staff in place element, which really does seem to suggest that Vrabel's going to wind up there. And also seems to suggest that Gerard Mayo was going to get fired prior to this game. If that's the way that you're going to go, you have to do everything in your power to lose this game. And I think you have to fire Mayo and you have to fire Alex Van Pelt prior to the game. You can't let them go out there and coach like they're going to win. And the response that I consistently got, that I'm curious your take on, was there's only so much they can do, that the Bills out-tanked them, that the Bills were doing a bunch of things, basically trying to lose, probably recognizing that it was worse for their division rival if the Bills did lose, and if the Patriots did win and the Patriots didn't land with the number 1 overall pick. I was basically in some of these conversations, you can't honestly believe there's not more that they could have done, because there's so much that you can do. It's not easy to tank. It's not easy to lose. And the very common refrain, and the thing that I got told like 12 times, as if this isn't a talking point that everyone says, is players and coaches don't tank. Yeah, that's why I'm saying you should have fired the coaches, first of all, and installed whatever puppet, friendly to the organization position coach you can get in there that will make sure that you're doing things that are hurting your win potential. And then on the other side, yes, I know the players aren't going to tank. And I know Joe Milton, I know they played Joe Milton. They weren't trying to win. They didn't play Drake May the whole game. And Joe Milton surprisingly played really effectively. And that's why you needed to have already made the other coaching decisions if you were going to fire them. So that in the second half, when Milton plays that great game, you can start to become a little bit of a roadblock. And I understand what this sounds like. And I had people saying that you're not competitive or this or that. One of the main edges in Dynasty I've learned over the years, Sean, is understanding the different points in the calendar year, that around the draft, the rookie draft, those draft picks have a higher price than they will if you try to sell them right before week 1, when people are trying to get their team better for the year. You could try to or acquire them right before it's time to go play. And I understand right now people are going to say that it's absurd that I'm suggesting they should have tried to lose. Players want to win, etc. I promise you, when we get to April, people are going to be looking back at this loss win as a catastrophic loss. When we're in draft mode, when we're talking about draft capital, when we're talking about trades that can happen and trade packages that can happen, people will look back at this and say, wow, the Patriots really should have lost that game, done whatever they could. And the biggest thing before I kick it to you that I want to point out in this game specifically, in case you didn't necessarily follow it closely, I didn't necessarily follow it really, really closely, but I had people telling me there's nothing they could have done. And so I went and dug into it. They were leading at half. Joe Milton did play good. I saw a lot of the highlights. I was watching it loosely. I was watching some of the red zone stuff, etc. To start of the second half, the Bills punt on the first drive. Patriots are up 14-10. Joe Milton fumbles. There's an aborted snap, whatever, and they give great field position to the Bills. Bills go down and score on short field position and take the lead. It's now 16-14 Bills. They missed their extra point. They're up 16-14. Patriots get the ball back. I'm giving that backstory because Milton has just turned the ball over. I don't believe that anybody. Now, I didn't realize this was an aborted snap, but anyway, I don't believe that anybody would have thought you were tanking if you then decided to just run the ball. What do the Patriots do? This is one of the most aggressive decisions they've made all year because they're coaching like it's week 18 and they have nothing to lose. They go out and they call pass plays on 6 straight snaps. They run it once, then they continue to call dropbacks. They end up with a 12-play field goal drive where they take the lead for good in the third quarter. There actually were 14 called plays because there were 2 plays negated by penalty. Shawn, 13 of the 14 plays were dropbacks. It's one of the most aggressive, pass-heavy. Their response to a fumble and giving up a short field, and Joe Milton playing a pretty good first half, was we need to lean into Joe Milton even more. We need to really give him an opportunity to go out and win this game. If you're trying to lose the game, you just run the ball straight up the middle. Very simple run concepts, and you punt. I mean, like, that's what they should have been. At that point, you're like, look, Joe Milton, you played a good first half. You put some good stuff on tape. We need to shut this down. But you have coach. That's what I think the interim coaches that I'm suggesting could have done in terms of what more could they have done. They could have tried to run the ball on this particular drive right here instead of taking the lead for good. And then the Bills, after that point, did what I'm suggesting. They just ran the ball a bunch and punted. And you early in this drive, they get a penalty. They get a 1st and 15, and they throw and they throw and they throw. Run the ball on 1st and 15, then run it again on 2nd and 12. Like, that's how you make sure that you have to punt. That's how you make sure that you lose without. I had people saying that, what do you want them to do? Intentionally throw an interception, punt it on 2nd down? No, I don't want them to do that. I want them to just run the ball and make some suboptimal decisions. Anyway, what did you think about the Patriots losing the number 1 pick there?
Well, it reminded me, and there were other teams that are kind of in this mix who also won either this week or last week and dramatically changed what their outlook is. I think that you have to fire the coaches so that you're working with a skeleton staff that is just overmatched. And that's one of the things that we see with the Bears is that they've been horrible since they fired their coaches, in part because their coaching staff is now, I mean, it was a bad coaching staff before, and now you have the remnants of a bad staff that is having to handle too many things. And they just look completely flustered during the games. The players aren't getting enough coaching, all of that type of dynamic. Now, they do defeat the Packers because the Packers commit multiple catastrophic blunders in that game. And also, I was so happy for Cairo Santos, who is not a great NFL kicker and has missed some big kicks. Such a relief for him to go into the offseason having made the kick instead of missing it. The Bears probably felt somewhat comfortable when they sent him out there that kick isn't going to be made.
Right.
But he does knock it down. The main thing I thought, though, and this kind of goes back to what I would do if I were the NFL commissioner, then I've talked a lot about all the rules that I would get rid of because we don't need all of these procedure things that make the game more complicated. I also think I would go to a pure lottery for picks. Now, not one that's weighted, just a pure lottery. One of the things that I was thinking is that I do think that for the integrity of the league, it creates problems when you incentivize losing.
Yep.
And one of the things we talk about a lot in the FFPC dynasty leagues that we really like is that there is a backdraw that matters. Now, the weakest teams do get buys, so they're still going to get either the 3rd or the 4th pick in a worst case scenario. Maybe you do something like that in terms of how it relates to the NFL level, which I know is what a weighted lottery would do. But the 6 teams that don't make the playoffs compete for the number 1 pick. That makes it more exciting. But it also creates a dynamic where you don't have managers, in order to make their team even worse and make sure that you lose out and get the 101, you'll have these really lopsided trades. Well, where teams that are already loaded trade virtually nothing for impact players because those are what the incentives are. You can't create incentives that are really bad for your league, right? Well, the NFL has those, which is that you have all of these games where teams aren't playing. If you're not playing, I mean, I think there are at least mild safety issues, but certainly there's an element here where I mean,
You want a modified backdraw where the best December and January record of all non-playoff teams gets the 101. So they
yeah,
have to play hard.
exactly. And I just even the teams that I think are resting their players because they've locked in a seed in the playoffs, that also bothers me. It would really bother me if I'm a Bengals fan to see what the Chiefs did. The Chiefs have been in that situation in the past, I believe, in Dick Vermeil's final year, where according to some of the DVOA types of metrics, the Chiefs were like the second or third best team in the entire NFL, and they ended up finishing, I believe, 11-5 and missed the playoffs entirely. Right? You have to have a better system across the board. And one of those things, I think if you want to have head to head be the first tiebreaker, that's fine. I think margin of victory needs to be the second tiebreaker. And that basically ends up being the only other tiebreaker that matters. Because in terms of, instead of a Byzantine type of tiebreak, similar to what we had with Rams Seahawks, if you simply go through and look at points scored, which we know is a good indicator of actually how good the teams are as well, right? You're going to incentivize teams playing in the fourth quarter of games. That's good for fans as they buy tickets and go to the games. I think it creates a better betting environment where you move away from concerns about games being fixed. And then we get more competitiveness down the stretch. I'd have to look into it more to see if it would actually make more games live. But if you could win by 60 in the final week and scrape out a playoff spot over a team that is resting their guys because they think they have it locked in, I mean, that again makes the league more competitive and creates more interesting storylines than the ones we have where a lot of teams don't try in the final week. And I know that one of the answers is just like, well, if you didn't want that to be the case, you should have won games earlier. The Bengals controlled their own destiny by winning, some of those games against the Ravens, just not being 9-8. 9-8 is not a good record. You don't tend to feel too bad about 9-8 teams. But you even think back to, Ben, a lot of listeners won't care that much about this, but the Arizona Diamondbacks had a fantastic season, won 89 games, had one of the best run differentials in baseball. They missed the playoffs in part because of a scheduling weather conflict where you had to move a doubleheader for the other teams that they were in contention with to a day after the season concluded, to where whoever wins the first game will probably tank the second game and get both of those teams in, and the Diamondbacks go out. That's a situation you're frustrated in when there are 162 games.
Mm-hmm.
When there are only 17 games, then yeah, again, you can go 17-0 and control your own destiny, but it is unfortunate when there are so few games that you can't control if another team that's out there competing with you is even going to have a real opponent in the final week. And that's garbage, right?
Yeah.
There are a variety of things you can do with the rules to address all of these integrity of the game issues. People aren't always going to like them, but again, I have a huge problem with the fact that you benefit so much from being terrible, right? Why do we structure incentives for teams to legitimately be bad? Now, there are things I think you could do that would be more moderate types of elements that wouldn't probably create as much in the way of tanking. I think you could do a pure lottery and then still come back in and add some compensatory picks for the very worst teams that, are on day 3. And so then you have some additional opportunities to add players to your team. Maybe you could create some salary cap exemptions for the worst teams. There are lots of things with Major League Baseball where, I mean, people will point out that Major League Baseball is dramatically screwed up. And you can have a team like the Dodgers just buy World Series. But at the same time, they do have some interesting things in there with different exemptions on this and that based on how much money you make, how much you win, what have you. You could do that for some of the bad teams. unfortunately, in most of these cases, the bad teams haven't spent to their limit either. But that's not true across the board. I mean, you could do some things to allow additional tactical benefits to bad teams that wouldn't create what we have right now, where, I mean, again, those trades that we've discussed and what the Bears managed to more or less throw it away. Some of the things the Browns did in the past to build up what could have been a super organization, they threw away with Deshaun Watson. But the value of tanking and getting these early picks and then trading down is so massive that it's actually a loophole that should be closed.
It absolutely should be. I think this is a great take. And yet, under the current rules where it doesn't exist, I was just shocked that the Patriots, especially when I thought there was a possibility they might keep Gerard Mayo, but when they fired him like immediately after the game, and you're getting reports by the end of the day that they've basically already picked a successor. The way you said it and the Bears thing was sort of the point I was trying to make on Twitter. And again, I know that there's people that are going to listen to this and be like, this sounds like somebody who just doesn't understand competitive sports. Believe me, like I do. And I think the players are going to play hard, and I think you want the players to play hard. The Bears thing is the great point. You already had, because I had some people that were like, why would you care? Gerard Mayo hasn't been able to win a game all year. Well, he's playing against a preseason defense. They're playing against a preseason opponent in this game. The Bills are not playing anyone. It does matter. And his poor coaching job permeates down to, or whatever. I don't even necessarily think that's a fair, because I think Gerard Mayo kind of got did dirty by all of this. I don't necessarily think that's a totally fair characterization of Gerard Mayo necessarily. Although the Patriots, Sean, you're looking at me very blankly right now. The Patriots were not a very good team this year. But
don't think Gerard Mayo should have been the head coach to start with.
Yeah, but right. It's a little bit. He certainly didn't have a huge pedigree, and it certainly felt a little bit like a bridge coach to some degree. You made the Bears.
To be clear, he's not the only guy in that category. There are plenty of retread coaches from other demographics who deserve it even less. So,
yep. The Bear point that you made, I just wanted to reiterate, was one we talked about all year with the Caleb Williams tough season. You already have a bad coach in place, a bad system in place that permeates down to everything you've done in the offseason. It permeates down to, I'm using the word permeate way too much. It doesn't permeate to what you've done in the offseason, but it starts from the offseason. It permeates down to the position coaches and the ways that the whole structure is in place. And so, yeah, we saw that with the Bears. When they fired Eberflus and they fired Waldron, it was already a bad situation. They didn't really have the other coaches in place to necessarily step up and make it a good situation, right? That doesn't always happen with interim coaches. In this case, again, you need to put in place coaches that are going to be like, we're going to do a pretty weak game plan, etc. I don't think.
Ben, I don't think this is what this was, but we've seen situations where coaches were set up for the number 1 pick or 2 pick or 3 pick and knew they were going to get fired, and their last act out the door was to make sure they won that last game.
Try hard
to penalize the team that's about to fire them by worsening the pick. I mean, in a very clear-cut way, you can see that as the owner,
exactly,
and the general manager. If the general manager, in fact, is not also going to be fired, again, it's not really competitive if your goal is to win, to go out and ruin your selections. That's
right.
Not competitiveness.
That's not competitiveness from an organization standpoint. Exactly. From the individual coach's standpoint, whether he's being fired, whether it's not been decided, whatever, he's going to go try to win. I mean, obviously he's going to go try to win. I mean, even like when you just described it as a coach going out the door, in those cases, yeah, they're sticking it to the organization. They're also like, I don't have any incentive to care about the pick in the future, but I do have an incentive to care about what my win-loss record was this year. When people go try to hire me in the future, are they really going to know the difference between 5-12 and 6-11? I want to get that 6th win or whatever it is. In this case, it was the 4th win. But yeah, I mean, you don't want to
finish on your resume forever.
Yeah, I want to be 4-13. I don't want to be 3-14. I mean, if I'm Gerard Mayo, of course, which again is why you can't risk that. You need to have somebody in place who understands that. I mean, we're talking about a massive, massive shift in the Patriots' ability to be successful in the future and do this rebuild. And the things you're talking about with the Browns, I mean, if you're going to go from first to fourth, you need it to be in a trade that includes a lot of other high leverage picks. I mean, I know this sounds uncompetitive. That's why anyway.
I guess
I'm
I don't
spending too
think
much
that it
time on it.
does. I think it speaks to the very mixed incentives, and that the NFL should do something about it, but then individual organizations need to make the moves that are right for them within the context of what the rules actually are.
But as you were talking about all the other incentives that could come into place in week 18, I think this is really fascinating. And this is like, I was really excited to talk to you today. I sent you like a list of notes and all this stuff. I mean, Bo Nix, you mentioned watching the Denver game. It was awesome to see how good he did. I wrote in some notes that I sent you that it was reminiscent of how good of a preseason he had, and at times didn't necessarily have a perfect regular season. They were so good in the preseason, and Knicks played in, I think, 3 different games. They scored in every possession that he quarterbacked in the preseason, and it was like 7 or 8 of them. They scored either a touchdown or a field goal, except for one where there was a position player fumble after a completion. It was either like Josh Reynolds or Tim Patrick or somebody fumbled. Somebody who's not even on the team anymore, but fumbled after a completion. Basically, you go into the regular season, he's a rookie. Things are different in the regular season against first team defenses and coaches calling complex defenses, which they're not necessarily doing in the preseason. Even when you caveat the stuff here in week 18 about it being against backups, you want to see him shred the backups the way that he did in this game. He has I think 3 incompletions, 26 for 29 game, 321 yards, 4 touchdowns. A lot of that was in the shorter area, which is something that comes up for him. But he throws some deep balls too, man. His touchdown last week to Marvin Mims was the longest air yards pass of the year, which was a really fun stat for a guy that everyone acts like can't throw the ball downfield. And you've been saying since prospect season, when you isolated for that stuff, he can throw downfield. Well, he winds up with the 65 air yard, league leading touchdown bomb that's on the money in week 17 in a key spot that they needed to win that game. He plays another huge game here to win. The Broncos are going to the playoffs, but that was against backups is sort of my point. You also got the Kyler game that you talked about against backups. Aaron Rodgers throws 4 touchdowns against backups. Geno Smith, 4 touchdowns against backups with the Rams. It's good to see these guys play well, Kyler Murray and Aaron Rodgers included, but obviously those guys struggled throughout the year. I guess my point
Kyler
is
Murray still can't get the ball to Marvin Harrison, even against backups. He does score. But I mean, you look at, and evidently Drew Petzig is one of the guys being requested to be interviewed. If you've been an Arizona Cardinals fan, you'd be mind boggled that their coaches would have any demand for them whatsoever. Although again, you're dealing with the fact in every given situation, the specifics of that situation, which are that if you're the offensive coordinator, it does cause you some problems when your quarterback can't see over the line. I do still think that unless Marvin Harrison turns out to be a huge bust, there's absolutely no excuse for what the offensive coordinator has done this season in terms of getting him involved. I do think he's a more limited player, and I've said that all along, but the things that he does well, he probably does really well. You've got to get to those things more often than the Cardinals do. Having watched the Broncos game, watched the Cardinals game, and then watch the Seahawks. I mean, the Seahawks were not nearly as impressive. The Jets game was not interesting to me. I haven't watched.
Yeah, that wasn't very impressive either.
The thing that stands out so much for Bo Nix and Michael Penix is that the game already seems very slow for them. Yeah. Whereas, I mean, Caleb Williams is maybe the most sped up quarterback I've ever seen. When I saw the final score there and then went back to watch the game, I was thinking, okay, well, he finished on a high note. They finally actually did something. Even if the Packers were benching some guys, they've got a good defense. They did want to win this game. He had to have played well. And then no, I mean, then
that's what I was thinking too. And
there should have been like 5 pick sixes, because if every single pass you throw is a wide receiver screen, at some point in the game, the defenders are going to start taking those the other way. That's not what happened.
It is.
But
the pick 6 isn't what happened. DJ Moore had 10 targets, 9 catches, 86 yards, and a TD. The TD was on basically a wide receiver screen that he took off. No one else on the team had more than 25 receiving yards. I mean, there wasn't a lot of downfield passing in this game. It was a very, very cold game. Jordan Love ends up leaving. Precautionary measure is what the word is. There was a note that this is the coldest game that either Caleb Williams or Jordan Love had played in on the broadcast, based on whatever, going back to college.
And the weather for Williams has been really bad the final month.
Yeah. I mean,
so I think you have to consider that.
Yeah. The coaching's been horrible. I mean, yeah, there's caveats we can make, but I had the same.
I mean, the two worst screen passes this week were thrown by Ben Johnson's team. They got Jahmyr Gibbs lit up like as the number one light up play of the entire year in that game last night. And then
somebody also Twitter, I think it was Mike Tanier, shared a hit from like the 1960s that it reminded him of. And I was like, that's not a great sign. You said the number one play of the year. He was thinking decade.
And then Jared Goff also threw a pass on a receiver screen that was almost another pick six for the Vikings there. So even the elite of the elite teams can make some of those mistakes. But I mean, it's really the only play the Bears called the entire game, which, I mean, that can't be your offense. But going back to the positives, it's crazy to see Bo Nix operating out there like he's running a college walkthrough. I mean, there is no pressure on him, which again, that really helps. And so Sean Payton deserves a lot of credit for how they schemed that up. And the offensive line deserves a ton of credit for the fact that, I mean, he's just out there like it's a walk in the park. There is no pressure on him. When there is pressure, he takes off and he runs for 50 yards. Michael Penix is just starting to play. And Ben, I do have to mention, I do have the advanced team stats tool pulled up. The Panthers and the Falcons going into the game had the second and third worst numbers in EPA allowed per play in the passing game. So for this to be a shootout was perhaps not a surprise. Obviously, neither defense helped their numbers in that game. It's about as sweet a finish as you can get if you're Bryce Young or you're Michael Penix, if you want to go into the offseason on a high note. But having said that, I mean, Penix looked better to my eye in these last couple of NFL games than he did as he was leading the Huskies to the national championship game. Obviously, Odunze and Polk haven't had great seasons. It does seem like a good degree of what Washington was doing was him, especially when you control for the fact that it's hard to look good throwing the ball out of your left hand. I mean, he looks absolutely fantastic. And this, I think, is interesting when we go back through and we think about how old those two guys are compared to the young superstar prospects and what we do tend to know about age. And yet that is one of the wonderful things, I think, especially about the NFL, but certainly about all sports and all of life, which is that you don't know what particular part of a profile is going to end up being definitive in terms of how it translates. And you still have, a range of outcomes, which we tend to talk about range of outcomes, almost purely as math, but it's a human type of thing where, I mean, these guys can go out and just look fantastic. The Falcons and the Broncos have to be a lot more excited than the teams who said, okay, after the top couple guys, this class isn't that strong. Maybe it's deep, but not really with starters. Obviously, the Vikings don't know what they have. But, I mean, we gave the Falcons a hard time. The main thing I was thinking as I watched that game was that, I mean, I was wrong. The fact that the Falcons, even though they invested massive amounts in the salary for Kirk Cousins and the draft slot for Michael Penix, again, maybe it'll end up being a little fluky. It's a huge difference playing horrible pass defenses and great pass defenses. You can go out the next week against a good pass defense and be like, oh, they've actually created problems. I'm not throwing against air. Man, those two guys look really, really good.
Yeah. Penix, I mean, he still missed some throws in this game. I guess I do want to say, I don't want to start from like a negative because my point is, even in a game where he missed some throws, he went 21 for 38. I don't think that even tells the story. I think that's unfair to him that he had 17 incompletions, because I think there is this lefty thing that you were talking about I think is plaguing them a little bit. Drake London had a couple drops. There were some drops in this game, is my point. His interception is for the second time now this year is one of his players juggling the ball up into the air to a defender, which was his pick to Kyle Pitt on a pass targeted to Kyle Pitts, whatever it was last week or a couple weeks ago in his first start. He got the same thing here from Ray McLeod, where it was a low throw. McLeod had a shot to catch it and somehow got his hands under it and basically slingshotted it up into the air. It should have just been on the ground, incomplete, if nothing else. Anyway,
it was going to get picked by somebody else if it hadn't been picked by the guy who was closest.
Yeah, it was the second time. So two interceptions Penix has had where, they haven't necessarily been on him. A couple of drops, like I said, but also some off-target throws. And I'm starting there to say that, having said that, you can see why it's not going to necessarily matter, because in addition to his off-target throws, he throws such a good spiral. He throws with such velocity, and he throws into those intermediate windows that we've been talking about for a few weeks. We saw that repeatedly. Those are the windows that are open when the safeties are dropping. They're going to have to come down now on him in the intermediate range. He's going to be able to, it's going to open up some of the deep passing for them long-term, I think. I think that's one of the big things that happens schematically for UW. And it is something that I've had to think about more as I've watched Penix in the pros, and you were talking about the wide receivers and even Kalen DeBoer at Alabama, and what Ryan Grubb's done at Seattle, and kind of seeing this group expand in different directions. Like DeBoer had some troubles implementing his same offense in Alabama with, they had some transfers away, but good personnel for the most part. And I do think part of the reason that UW was able to so relentlessly attack downfield, as I would always talk about their offense last year, was just this element of Penix being able to consistently hit these intermediate windows. It really does create a problem. Even if you're dropping into nickel as much as NFL teams are, dropping into dime, putting so many DBs on the field, that also opens up rushing lanes. Bijan Robinson, 28 carries, 170 yards, 2 touchdowns in this game. I got to imagine that was a season high in rushing yards for him. It was only his 5th 100-yard game. His previous season high, 125. He had 2 rushing TDs in each of Michael Penix's 3 starts. I'm going to be very excited to draft Bijan Robinson next year, because I do had 90-plus rushing yards and 2 rushing TDs in all 3 of those games. I do think Penix is going to have a very positive effect on him. We saw it with Dylan Johnson, who ended up getting invited to the combine, not really an NFL talent, ended up on an NFL team somewhere, I think a UDFA. He was the UW's running back who had an awesome year last year as a result of, again, this vertical passing attack that opened up so much space underneath. I mean, that was the big thing that Dylan Johnson was able to take advantage of. Bijan, with his talent, getting those, all of a sudden getting those lanes underneath as well. He showed you what he could do these last few games. The other guy I want to talk about real quick is Drake London. 18 targets. He did have some drops issues I mentioned, but 10 catches, 187 yards, 2 TDs. Darnell Mooney was out of this game. Kyle Pitts does nothing. 3 targets, 2 catches. Raymond McLeod has 7 targets, 4 catches. There's only 21 completions for Atlanta, 10 of them to Drake London. London had 7 catches for 106 last week. I think this is what we talked about as well. When Penix came in, these intermediate throws might be really good for Drake London. It's a boost for me to Drake London going into next year. These are 2 of his 300-yard games on the year he has in Michael Penix's 2nd and 3rd games as a starter. I don't think that's a coincidence. Pretty exciting element for him going forward, that those are the routes he runs in between, the dropping linebackers, the cover 2 corners that are cutting you loose on the sideline, the safeties over the top. Sometimes those safeties are coming down, etc. Penix is going to have his issues, but he can rip those throws. And even when that's why, again, I started with these misses. Even when he does miss some of those, he hits enough of that stuff that you're getting the chunk gains in the passing game that you can't get in the modern NFL, and you need, and opens up the running attack. It opens up everything, and it's going to be great for London. But some of these throws he made in this game, as you were talking about, he looked awesome. He had the one to Ray McLeod on kind of a flag route, a corner route, where McLeod almost starts to jog because he's like, this ball doesn't get to me in the modern NFL. There's kind of 2 defenders around him, and then he sees the ball's coming to him, and he kind of picks up his speed. Like right as he started to slow down, he picks up his speed, has to lay out for it, makes a great catch. But I mean, it's just a perfectly thrown ball into, again, that was more of a deep intermediate window, but into one of those windows where, I mean, if you can throw that into a tight window like that, that's a really, really impressive throw that changes the way the secondary has to defend you. Like I said, even if you miss throws, it will change the way the defense has to defend you. It will make your whole offense more effective. I'm going to be excited for the Falcons again next year. I mean, even if he struggles, it'll be a little bit like Jameis Winston. The decisions Jameis Winston makes they were very positive for Jerry Jeudy's stats, right? They're very positive for, like, Jerome Ford was putting up numbers when Jameis Winston was playing for the Browns this year. This type of quarterbacking, the ability to push into the intermediate range with accuracy and hit those chunk gains in the pass game, that's what defenses want to take away. They have to put even more resources into that, and it opens up other stuff that's just going to be, I think, really exciting for Atlanta. So that was a really fun thing from week 18 for me, and for Drake London, for Bijan for next year. I think it's exciting stuff.
And you mentioned some of those incompletions. When a quarterback is pushing the ball the way Penix is and hitting a lot of these passes, it just matters so much less. And I mean, that was the overwhelming feeling as you watch this game, is that we just don't see this in the contemporary NFL. We don't see a quarterback consistently hit those. I mean, they're not necessarily fly patterns, but those deep, what you might call deep intermediate routes and passes, and do it over and over and over. Now, again, you have to mention that the Panthers defense is not that different than playing a defense that's resting its starters. Yeah. But one of the things that is going to probably be true for guys like Baker Mayfield and Michael Penix and Bryce Young is that they're playing in the NFC South. Things can change very, very quickly. But there's the likelihood that when you're playing more mild weather games, a lot of dome games, and you're playing in a division that features
there's no defensive talent,
really soft defenses, that, I mean, you're going to have some, and it just gets better and better if you have guys like Mayfield and Young and Penix. I mean, Young is the other massive story from this game, where, I mean, you could make the point that he's not throwing to a Drake London. I mean, he's probably just throwing to scrubs and tears the Falcons apart. But if you get young QBs, or in Mayfield's case, just a fun gunslinger, and all of these guys are put together in a division that can't play defense, I mean, that's fantasy football nirvana.
Jalen Coker, 7 targets, 7 catches, 62 yards, and completed a pass for 19 yards. Jalen Coker's not a scrub. That dude's efficient. He's good. I think he's going to be.
Well, the good news and the bad news for Carolina is simultaneously that Jalen Coker is better than Xavier Legette.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. I hesitated when I said I think he's going to be a long-term viable NFL wide receiver. He's not going to be a superstar. I mean, let's be honest, but he looks good. You like to see the efficiency from a rookie right away. We know that leads to more volume in the future. They leaned into him. They played him more down the stretch. Jalen Coker is going to be a later round year 2 wide receiver to consider next year. That's interesting. But yeah, week 18, Sean. I mean, there was so much stuff. Tyreek Hill seemed to demand a trade after the game. I don't really know if there's a whole lot to discuss there. He was just upset. I mean, maybe that was just reactionary. Another wide receiver who had a monster game.
I would caution Tyreek Hill that when you've gotten to play your career with Patrick Mahomes and then with Tua and Mike McDaniel, that there are a lot of teams that might be interested in you as someone who could help their passing offense, where the situation isn't 1 tier below what you've experienced or 2 tiers below, but like 3 or 4 or 5 tiers below. Yeah. Certainly a case of be careful what you wish for.
He talked in that same interview. I listened to the whole segment about, because he got asked, what do you think is the biggest reason you guys missed the playoffs? And he was like, there's a lot of reasons, this, that, and the other thing. But he said not having QB1 out there for a stretch of time. I mean, he is aware of what it's like when you're playing with somebody other than Tua for a stretch like he had this year. That could be your every week. That's what like Malik Neighbors dealt with for most of this year. Malik Neighbors set the rookie reception record. Brock Bowers regained it the very next game window. And he winds up 3rd in the NFL in receptions this season. I believe I heard also that it was the first time a tight end had finished top 3 in receptions I think I may have caught that on the broadcast. Don't quote me on it, but he was third, as I said. And then Trey McBride, only one catch behind him, was fourth in one fewer game. McBride probably actually could have still finished ahead of Bowers there, but Bowers easily the tight end one in total points. We're going to talk in a future show about some of the finishes because it's interesting to just think about how the value is going to go for fantasy relative to the finishes. But I compiled a bunch of notes on stuff like that, on where Bowers and McBride finished, et cetera. A lot of different players. But yeah, the week 18 stuff was fascinating. You get the rookie reception record, like I said. You get the Jamar Chase triple crown. Quentin Johnston, Sean, 14 targets, 13 catches, 186 yards. I feel like I didn't really catch this game a lot. And I was thinking coming into the game that he was sort of going to be my line of demarcation this year of when the wide receiver window closed, because he scored a lot of touchdowns. And I think people thought his year 2 breakout was more impactful than it probably was. And he's probably going to go in the high double-digit rounds because he's going to run meaningful routes and he's tied to Justin Herbert. Basically, I didn't think he had this in him. I didn't think he had the potential to have a 186-yard game, 13 catches on 14 targets. Such an efficient 186-yard game. Did you watch this game?
No, I have not.
Okay.
So I can't speak to all of that. I do think that it's a shocking number. At the same time, I've always felt that it was a little bit unfair that as soon as you have some struggles as a rookie, that you get so much piling on. I understand that that's kind of the way that the industry works. And certainly, we're not going to be in any way immune, nor do we want to be, of talking about the guys that we really liked who did well. I mean, certainly very excited about Bo Nix, very excited about Brock Bowers, very excited about Bucky Irving, very excited about guys like Jaden Daniels and Malik Neighbors. I've mentioned a number of times that I thought the stats were very clear that Malik Neighbors was a better prospect than Marvin Harrison. That's something that you can say when it looks like that in the moment. And yet, if it had gone the other direction, certainly the things that Harrison had going for him, you can make that claim of, okay, well, those are the things that translated. When you look at Quentin Johnston, though, and you're talking about someone who was very efficient on a per route basis in college and is big and explosive, right? For him to be picked in the first round and for the Chargers to be so hammered on that selection, when you consider that, someone like a Jordan Addison, whom I love and think is going to be a star and thought was somebody you had to pick on almost every team this year, but a guy who had, some questionable numbers in his final year in college with Caleb Williams on a per route basis. You look at someone like a Zay Flowers, a lot of really good things to his profile, didn't necessarily pop on a per route basis and an age adjusted basis. When you look at some of those types of things, you look at the guy in Ladd McConkey, who's had such a great rookie season for them. And I mean, he was basically just a version of Johnston who didn't play very much and didn't have nearly the responsibilities. Now, again, that strips out a lot of other context that's really important. So I'm not saying that anybody who, worked through some things on Quentin Johnston and didn't think he deserved to be a prospect that level of prospect was necessarily wrong either. But I do think someone who's coming in with production, coming in with elite athleticism, and then they go through a bad stretch, give them a little bit of time, give them some more coaching and see what they have. And one of the things that I thought was interesting was you did get the sense from the Chargers coaching staff early on that they weren't blown away by him and they didn't necessarily plan to make him a focal point. At the same time, they did go through the motions of saying, we think based on our evaluation that the previous coaching staff used him completely incorrectly and did not accentuate his strengths. We're going to do that. I mean, the Chargers are actually not that talented a team outside of their quarterback. They're probably going to be a lot better in the intermediate future than they are right now. I mean, they're not that far away from being a scary team. Right now, they're mostly a team that was able to beat bad teams this year, which is something that's important. You do need to be able to do that. If you can simply beat the bad teams, of which there are so many currently, then you will be in the playoffs. But you look at all of the little things that the Chargers coaching staff does, where they are able to come through on elements like knowing what McConkey's good at, knowing what Johnston's good at, knowing that they have a star QB and that you can build some of the offense around it, even if maybe you would prefer to be, more run heavy. I think it's a real tribute to this coaching staff that they have there in LA and to Justin Herbert that you can work through and get to this point. I mean, is Johnston going to have drops issues again in the future that kind of get him pushed to the side?
That's
a real possibility, right? Because I mean, if you really do struggle to catch NFL passes, is that going to completely go away? I mean, probably not. But
this would be my pushback.
He's so talented.
Yeah, as you were talking through that, it seemed like more of a pre-2024 discussion, which I think is really fair. And I think people are too out on him too quick. I was in on him as well. And perhaps to that regard, but like we watched 2024. He wasn't very good in 2024. And that's where I was talking about like the line of demarcation for next year, et cetera, where he had 8 touchdown season. And I think some people are going to be in on him because of the size and speed again and the situation. Even with this game, he winds up with a pretty low catch rate, especially considering that they did a lot of the quick hitting stuff with him at times, a lot of the drag routes. Like he dropped some drag routes, flat, short passes that like, I mean, if you have any ball skills, you catch those 100 times out of 100, legitimately, like wide open. Yards per target still wound up below average for a guy with a high ADOT. However, I mean, I know people don't like yards per target as a number, but it gets back to the low catch rate and the drops issues and et cetera. Basically going into last week, Shawn, he didn't have a single game all year where he caught more than 5 passes, and he's been running a lot of routes. He's had games with 10 targets, one game with 10 targets, multiple games with 8 targets, another one with 7, multiple more with 6, had never caught 6, 7, 8 passes in a game. He has 13 in this game. I mean, again, when I say I didn't think he had it in him, it wasn't just because of a lot of the things you just addressed about his profile or his rookie career, because I thought the bounce back this year was plausible. It was more about everything I've seen in 2024. He hasn't been good this year. He's been okay. He's made plays. He's scored touchdowns, but like a lot of that to me is like Justin Herbert has put the ball on him. I've had complaints with him about the late hands thing where like when he's closely guarded on the sideline, Herbert's throwing some good passes and he just puts his hands out there and DBs have just put their hand over it and knocked it away. And it's like, you're making that too easy on the DB. Some of those wide receiver skill things that I just don't think he has.
It's interesting because this game would suggest that the quarterback and the coaching staff haven't given up on him. It's almost more that than the numbers, right? Where all of those little things, you're tending to feel like the player is either not intuitive or they're not a particularly hard worker, that they're not locked into the details, and that they probably will continue along that same basic path. A guy who isn't really the same, but has been fascinating to track this year with the Lions is Jameson Williams, where, I mean, a lot of people are like, oh, he came into the NFL as a vertical player and now he can do these different things. It's like, I mean, maybe not. I mean, one of the reasons he was a vertical player at Alabama is simply because when he would run down the field, no one could stay with him. And then Bryce Young would throw it over the top. So why would you take 5 passes to get where you can get with 1? Right. At the same time,
now he's catching passes over the middle and taking hits and stuff. And he's like reasonable for a small dude, a speedster. He's reasonably good at catching these, intermediate passes in contact.
Yeah, you expect him to lose the ball on a lot of these hits where he has not. Not everybody is the same. Not everybody who gets off to a slow start or struggles with some details or makes some questionable off the field decisions. And there are a lot of different layers or shades of what those things can be. There can be some that are complete deal breakers right from the start, and some you just certainly wish the player had made a slightly different decision. But you work through those things. I mean, Jameson Williams at this point, if he weren't in such a loaded offense, you'd be talking about him as being a 2nd-round pick next year. Quentin Johnston is not nearly in that same frame, and yet the other really interesting player from that class who seemed like he was going to be a star by a variety of metrics, and yet was also someone that a lot of scouts had questions about. And you can see that from where he was drafted, is another guy who's absolutely exploded over the last month, and that would be Marvin Mims. And so you have a coaching staff that claimed that they were going to be, so smart and they had made such a good pick and he was going to be a game changer for them. And then a year and a half later, you're like, you told us A, that he was good, and B, that you guys were geniuses and it was going to all be fine. And he's got like 3 NFL receptions. Well, Marvin Mims has been unstoppable the last month, and we've gotten the genius in terms of how they've used him out of the backfield a lot. And you say, well, it's not really genius just to throw short passes to a guy who can't get open down the field. But you're getting the ball in a playmaker's hands. You're accomplishing some of those things that you might want to accomplish with a Christian McCaffrey or a Jahmyr Gibbs. The Jahmyr Gibbs receiving touchdown again in the game last night was absolutely fantastic. He's been a little bit disappointing from a volume perspective as a receiver in his career, but that's the second time he's essentially run that route and done it so crisply and so explosively that the defense, especially with the defense they had called on the play, had absolutely no chance. That is, such a game changer for the Lions there. But then you throw in the ability to get Mims open down the field, which they have started to consistently do. And you have both of those things. The players are certainly not the same, but you do have some similar attributes where you have a vertical ability, you have an underneath ability. Maybe you don't have all of those plays that we were talking about with Michael Penix and Drake London, where the guy can be a true difference maker who dominates a game by dominating the intermediate depths. But I mean, Johnson again, Mims again, those guys are both extremely athletic. If their coaching staffs have figured them out, if their QBs have developed a true rapport with them, they're going to be very difficult to play in fantasy because you're just simply not going to get the target volume. I don't think that the volume for Johnston in this game is indicative of what it's going to be. I mean, if he's going to do well for you in 2025, he's going to need to score touchdowns like he did this year, but it's still just such a positive sign.